Hello, and welcome to our Strasz Assessment Systems podcast, Beyond the Test Strasz Talks. I'm Dr. Roy McCorkle, your host, and I'm very excited about our session today. We're going to be speaking with Steve Dept, who is joining us to talk about, one of the areas of focus for his work in terms of cultural linguistic bias, the advent of AI in his space, and a host of other things. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Rory. Thank you very much for having me. Delighted to be on your podcast.
Well, thank you for taking the time to join us. We're excited to hear a little bit more about what you've been up to over there at cApStAn, where you're the founder and indeed have certainly made an imprint on the assessment industry over the time you've been here. Speaking of which, though, how did you get here? Tell us a little bit about what took you into the assessment profession.
Like many other people, I have this strange, contorted way to get there, and delighted I got there, though. I am a linguist by training. I started studying classical philology, Oriental philology, comparative linguistics. I even envisaged to be a researcher in linguistics. But everything was so slow in the European academic world, and I was so keen to, act, invent, create, work, that I very quickly went into the private industry, and I started a translation business, and I had to translate for universities, mainly psychological papers and reports into languages that I did not master. So I had to hire two translators at least, one to translate, another to review. But I have a very good passive knowledge of a number of languages. And I could see that many of those reviewers, revisers were adding their personal touch without adding much value. So I thought that there was a gap, and I started writing guidelines for reviewers. Don't fix things that are not broken. If you fix them, have a reason for it. And so as I was working for this, the OECD launched a call for tenders for the program for international student assessment, PISA. At the time, for the OECD countries, they wanted to measure knowledge and skills in 15-year-old students across the world. So, around school leaving age, just before that. Mm-hmm. And one of the contractors tendering for that big project back in 1998 was one of my clients. And they asked me, Steve, could you come up with a methodology to check whether the translations of all those reading and science and mathematics items that will be developed by item authors, that these translations will have the same level of difficulty, will measure the same constructs. And I thought, yeah, that sounds like a good challenge. And bold and young as I was, I said, yes, I'll do it. And that was the end of my career in linguistics. It started to be something completely different. I had to study psychometrics. I had to understand, what a p-value was, what a point biserial discrimination item fit, all things that you don't learn in linguistics, and then map the two together. And PISA was the beginning for me, because looking for ways to maximize comparability across language versions of items is a huge task. It's very complex, and I saw that it would be a life's work. And after PISA, the first round of the first field trial of PISA 2000, what I delivered was, let's say, promising at best. I was a bit ashamed of what I delivered. There was some useful feedback, but I don't think we had achieved functional equivalence at all. There was, after the field trial, you could see where the item bias was, and you could not always trace it back to translation error. So anyway, PISA was a big project, and I thought there may be other people measuring things in various languages. So I founded cApStAn with Andrea Ferrari, my associate, and we went to all the people who measure. We went to the IEA, the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement in Boston College. We went to the Gallup World Poll, to UNESCO, to UNICEF. And it turns out many of them were measuring things in several languages, and many of them had to throw a lot of data away because it was just not comparable. There was too much diff. And so we worked on a methodology that it's a work in progress. It's still not complete, but after 26 years, we have this wealth of empirical data, and there are certain known recurring issues that we are able to detect. Then, interestingly enough, and that will bring us to the topic of this session. It's in the beginning, I was just asked to validate translations that were produced by people in different countries and to have experts, teachers, psychologists, subject matter experts, and linguists look together at the features, let's say the linguistic features that drive the psychometric properties of the items and see whether the conditions were met. And we'd still miss quite a few things, but we'd find out that many of the issues we detected were recurring and across languages. So if you have a test item and that is translated into, let's say, 40 languages, and in 20 of the languages, you see that the translators have added information. To me, it doesn't mean that half the translators did a bad job and over-translated. To me, it means that the original text, the original item, is worded in English in such a way that it's very hard to translate without adding information. So gradually we shifted to upstream work, to looking at the source versions. Will they be translatable? Will they be portable? Will they give rise to possible item bias, to perception shifts? And so I'd say that now the lion's share of our work is to prepare the translation process, to write instructions for the translators, to analyze the translatability and the robustness of the source items, then possibly to do some piloting and cognitive testing with translated versions afterwards. But the actual verification of translation is now less troublesome than it used to be, because we do much more work upstream.
When you said this was a life's work, you really meant it, eh?
Oh, yeah.
To say the least. Well, I appreciate that background, and certainly, you're not the first to make that right turn. Although I must say, I feel compassion for anyone with a linguistics background who has to merge into our field of psychometrics, my lord. But you are bringing some of this work that you've been doing recently to light here in an upcoming session at the E-Assessment Association, their conference that's occurring in London, which I'll be excited to join you at here on the 10th of June. You'll be doing a presentation entitled "How Reliable Can an Automated Item Health Check Be?" And that session really does focus on how these biases, cultural, linguistic, so on and so forth, often unintentionally make their appearance in the items in which we use. So curious to hear from your perspective, what are some of those most common examples that you've run across that test developers and psychometricians often overlook?
Yeah, I could speak hours about those, and there are many. First, one has to realize that no matter how well or how poorly item writers master their language, they come with their social backgrounds, with their assumptions, with their own writing skills, and that influences the item. Sometimes, as you say, in totally unintended way. You have social markers in writing everywhere. But they're easy to detect, they're easy to code. It's just that they're not easy to prevent in item writers. There are also constructs that do not behave the same way at all across cultures. There is, for example, allowed and not allowed is something that muddies sensible or senseless in a number of cultures. I can give you an easy example. There was an open-ended item in an early international assessment that was about the items that you should not take into your hand luggage because they're inflammable or explosive. Those things that you're not allowed to take on board on the airplane. And so it was an open-ended question. Why should you refrain from taking a lighter refill in your hand luggage? It's an old test. It was back in the early 2000s. And in Europe, you can really see this divide where Scandinavia, Germany, Netherlands, Austria, the German part of Switzerland, they all overwhelmingly replied that it's because they're inflammable, because they're explosive. They looked for a rationale, they looked for a reason. Whereas in Spain, France, Portugal, French part of Switzerland, Greece, the south, the Mediterranean was more, well, because it's prohibited, and it was totally unexpected. The item was well translated, but in Italy, the day that safety belts became compulsory in cars, they produced T-shirts with black stripes across the breast. What is allowed, what is not allowed is very important. When do you cross that border? When do you provoke? That is key. In the northern states, well, there is a reason for that law. I want to understand the reason for that law. So these are very subtle things that you don't know when you write an item. It's only an empirical finding that can help you isolate that construct. If allowed, not allowed is in your question, it may muddy your construct. Then totally different, the structural ones, a broken stem item. Those items where the first half of the question is half a sentence, and the response options are the second half of the sentence.
Absolutely. Yeah, we also call them sentence completions. Yes.
Exactly. We call them truncated stem items, and they just don't work in Korean or in Turkish, where it's impossible not to have the verb at the end. You would either have to have those response options at the top and the question at the bottom, which in turn doesn't work, or you would have to have full sentences for each of the options, and that increases the reading load. So you can prevent that. Just, structure your item a bit differently, and it's okay. And if you don't know it in advance, well, you're going to waste a lot of time and resources. There's the level of reading proficiency that is needed to take a test. We've been asked to look at tests for programmers. They have great programmers in India, in China, in Japan, who don't know English that well, and the test was English, but they all know what a nested string is. That's not a problem. It's a technical term. But they don't know the rest of the English well enough to take the test, and then you miss part of the talent pool. So looking at the level of proficiency that is needed to take a test is very important, because if you're not measuring reading proficiency, you don't want that reading proficiency to blur your construct, blur your measurement. There's the setting. Don't make an item about ski if you're going to a ski resort, if you're going to work in sub-Saharan Africa. I've seen that happen. So, if your item is about baseball, make sure that you can adapt it easily to cricket if you go to India or to something else. But baseball is unknown in many parts of the world. Don't talk about the metro for countries that have never seen a metro and don't know what that is about. So the setting is important. There are so many others. Proportional length of key and distractors. That's something I learned in the literature, that an undecided respondent is likely to select the item that sticks out. So if you have a perfectly translated multiple choice question, but instead of having the distractor 2 sticking out, you have the key sticking out, you've changed the psychometric properties of the item. And so it's very easy to code that. You can have a little flag whenever the proportional length of the key or the distractor is not respected, and then you look if you can solve that. It's easy to prevent those things. But obviously translators are not aware of that. Why should they be? Yeah.
Of course. No, and I mean that in particular, it's a tough thing, especially if you're starting from an English base. You may have a perfectly parallel aligned set of 4 options. When you translate it, you see how rapidly that can either blow out or shrink depending upon the reading load of those other languages. Yeah.
And then there's many of those biases were previously unforeseeable, and so it's really the empirical findings, and for us with NLP, the systematic tagging that allow us to zoom in on recurring issues that are now known issues with known workarounds. And previously they went undetected, but now certainly with AI, if you've done your tagging properly for years and years and you have a knowledge base, not just ask an agent, but you have a real ontology, a real knowledge graph behind that, and you have principled design, you can go a long way with the help of AI in recognizing patterns, because that's something AI is good at. It's not so good at being creative, in my view. It's not so good at discernment. By recognizing patterns, that's really the thing they're good at.
Yes. No, absolutely. Well, and that sets up a lovely transition here to diving in further. One of the reasons for this presentation that you're giving in a couple weeks here is that aspect of your work, which is focused on automation with, of course, human in the loop. So, curious if you could elaborate on, based upon that work, where do you see humans adding the greatest value, and where should organizations be thinking about integrating automation, more effectively to reduce both effort and cost, as well as hopefully, the quality of the end product?
Yeah, that's $1 million question.
And that's why you're here, Steve.
If I had the perfect answer to that, I'd be richer than I am. But let's say I very much like the rule of Pareto, the rule, the 20/80 rule. I think AI with 20% of preliminary effort will produce 80% of good results. The problem is the last 20% that are so unreliable, and it takes 80% of the work, of the effort to solve whatever goes wrong in those 20%. So let's say we have to find out, whenever AI produces something, where are those 20% that are unreliable? How can we detect them? How can we single them out? How can we focus on those parts without reviewing the entire thing? Because that would sort of defeat the purpose if you have to produce everything automatically and then review everything. The concept human in the loop deprecates the human a little bit, because it just, it says, well, there's the AI and then there's the human. That's another step. And once the human has been there, everything will be all right. But no, we need a specific expertise for specific types of errors. And so it's not any human, and it's not any part of the AI that gets devised. So that discernment, I think is important. In the translation area, I can say that for now, we've had mixed results in using automated quality estimation and automated quality evaluation to detect what in the automated translation requires the most attention. We've had some good results, but we have to spend a lot of time in setting thresholds, saying, okay, anything that is has a more than 80% confidence level seems safe, seems okay. But if half the material has a 70% confidence level, that means you have to review half the material, right? So it really depends where you set the thresholds. In test evaluation, I've had somewhat better results. Now you have LLM-based validators that automate the checking, and they can actually perform quite well when you give them very precisely circumscribed parameters that they need to analyze, and you have different agents for each parameter. The models can do quite well, but it takes a lot of work to prepare those and supervise those. So I would say, for the moment, automation will reduce the repetitive effort that we were used to in the past, but there will be a new type of effort, which will be the discernment needed to set up the systems that can, as accurately as possible, detect those areas where the AI is less reliable and requires more focus. And if you can zoom in onto those parts that are weaker, you will save some money, so a lot of effort, but not replace and say by a push of a button we'll now do what we used to do with teams of SMEs.
Yeah.
I really don't see that happening in the near future. I see leaner, more agile development. I see more efficiency. I see even improvement of quality and consistency in some areas. But the work of the SMEs, of the human supervisors, of the linguists, of the evaluators will certainly change, and they will need to master those tools in order to remain relevant. But they will not have less work.
Yeah.
It's just different work. That's my
Indeed.
take on it.
Well, and I think, Steve, generally that's been, the finding in a lot of areas, not all,
Yeah.
but a lot of areas. So I would certainly concur with that. And, um, within this space, I mean, many organizations who do make that conscious decision to do translation and localization properly, let's say, or with the amount of depth that would be required by a number of the international standards. They do struggle with that, both from, to your point, time and expense and energy. When it comes to the investment required for cultural sensitivity reviews, back translation and assessments of those, as well as, item health checks. So, how do you see it really shaping up for organizations as you present some of this work to integrate tools like these into their development workflows without, let's say, displacing too much of existing process?
Yeah. You've actually answered part of the question yourself already, Rory. It's the thing is that when cultural reviews and translatability assessments and item health checks are regarded as standalone processes, they're outsourced, then they are extremely resource intensive and time consuming. When those processes are embedded in the test design and integrated in the assessment platform, one does save a lot of time and effort. Now, what we've done recently, you'll see that in London, we've joined forces with a platform. They're called Innovate. They're a Norwegian platform, and they really offer this end-to-end support from test authoring to analysis of results. And because they are developers and they're lean and agile and they are open to adapting their integration so that we can flow together. Now the item health check or the translatability assessments can really be part of the workflow. They can be monitored in the same interface. And that's not just a technical integration. It allows these checks to happen continuously. The item developers write, ask for an automated health check, and write again, and all of that in the same interface. And that costs much less. It's leaner, it's more agile, and it can happen continuously and earlier in the item lifecycle. So instead of waiting until items are very mature or almost finalized and then sending them through separate review cycles, item writers and reviewers can receive feedback while developing content. I think that will lower the threshold for using cultural reviews and translatability assessments systematically. I think there should be several levels. If you're just drafting your item and you want early feedback, that can be automated, and there are things that are useful in there, and it's not foolproof yet. If you want the full thing, you say, okay, now my item is almost mature. I ask that again, and I push the button. Please have the senior linguist and the senior consultant look at this report and add their 2 cents. And that takes another day. It doesn't disrupt your entire workflow. It's another day in the same platform, right? So for me, if it becomes part of normal item development rather than an additional process layer, we're onto something. And their AI helps. It's not the panacea. I mean, there's still some work to be done. And what I also like about this idea is that it potentially creates much better traceability and documentation of review decisions.
Mm.
If it's inside the same platform and there's this area where every time a choice is made based on item health check or often SME feedback, it's documented in the same place, in the central repository, let us say. So, well, you of course, to get there, you continuously work on your UI, your internal documentation software, and so on. But for me, there's the key idea is don't make them separate process, standalone process that need to be outsourced. Work with platform providers that are able to, and there are several. I'm sure there are several. I'm now working with a small one on an experimental basis and find it thrilling to see how much information can be stored in one place and pulled out when you need it in real time. But yeah, the recommendation would be make sure that your cultural reviews, your translatability assessment, if you're going to translate, or your health checks, which are also valid for monolingual settings, take them as a part of the item development, part of a continuous workflow, feedback in real time, and you're going to get used to doing that automatically without saying, "Oh no, now I still have to go to that cultural review process."
Sure. Well, and I think certainly if one of the positive outgrowths of these changes and innovations, let's say, is that more organizations who, of course, we have more and more organizations, number one, testing on a multi-region, multi-country, or a global scale. But if the result of this is more of them embedding in some additional positive aspects of this process, and indeed, hopefully, improving the outputs that they create for translated items, I think that will certainly be a victory.
Yeah. And that victory is it's not a total victory. It'll be a work in progress. It'll be granular. It'll sometimes be anecdotal. It'll be a staggered process, but it is within reach.
Yes. Well, I think, Steve, you certainly have encapsulated this well, and I will say I'm looking forward to hearing more when you have your presentation on the 10th of June. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. You and I have crossed paths multiple times in our professional lives here, but I think this is, aside from prepping some presentations in the past, this is probably the most in-depth we've gotten a conversation about, your week in, week out work, and it's been a joy to hear. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, your questions are excellent, and you're a genial host. So thank you very much for having me.
Well, it's been my pleasure. And to all who spent your time to listen to this podcast, I thank you. For anyone amongst our listeners who is going to be at EAA, please, say hi to both Steve and I. We'll look forward to seeing you in that wonderful conference environment. And indeed, also be on the lookout for our next podcast, which should be in about 2 weeks. Before we take a break here for July and August. So with that said, thanks once more. Be safe and be well. Take care.